My pleasure to invite you, Professor Stephen Wheatcroft, one of the world leading specialists of Russian, Soviet, and East European economic, social, and demographic history, and also of Soviet political history. He is an internationally recognized authority of Soviet repression, Soviet and comparative famines. Professor Wheatcroft was educated in Britain at Keele University and the Center for Russian and East European Studies in Birmingham University before moving to Australia in the 1980s, where he became a while the foundation director of the Center for Russian and European Studies at Melbourne University. Professor Wheatcroft remained teaching in Melbourne University for over 30 years. 30 years. He had extensive experience in working in Soviet, Russian, and Ukrainian archive from Soviet times. At an early stage of his career, he had the opportunity to work for 2 years at the Plekhanov Institute, the Moscow Institute for National Economics, when he met and formed a close relationship with many leading Soviet historians in Russia and Ukraine, who have subsequently historians in their separate countries. Professor Wheatcroft has worked on the publication of several volumes of archival materials with Russian and Ukrainian historians and archivists. Of particular note in his contributions to the Viktor Danilov team in the tragedy of the Soviet village series published in Russia, and to the Ukrainian series Commanders of the Great Famine. Professor...
Edited by you.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Professor Wheatcroft has also undertaken extensive work in the Kazakh archives, and when he worked at Nazarbayev University for 2 years a decade ago, and has had 2 intensive periods of working in the Moldovan archives, including of that has just ended.
Where
With Igor.
Is the director of the archive.
Yeah. Professor Wheatcroft is the author of 7 books and over 80 articles. He was elected a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2005. Miguel is here. Professor Wheatcroft received a medal of distinguished service in development of science in Republic of Kazakhstan from the Ministry of Education and Science of the Republic of Kazakhstan, 2012, and has received numerous visiting international fellowships. His numerous postgraduate students hold leading teaching and research positions in the US and Australian universities. And now, Steve, please.
Okay, thank you. Can I switch the... Oh, they've gone off. Right, great. I want to say how delighted I am to be here, and I'm pleased Miguel has arrived, because I particularly want to thank Miguel, not only for inviting me, but for allowing me to bring our group together. This is a research group funded by the Australian Research Council with Philip in charge of it, but it includes obviously Ukrainian, Moldovan, Australian and American scholars. We were meant to be meeting in either Moscow or Kiev, but under current circumstances we were looking for somewhere else to go, and when I received Miguel's invitation to come here, I thought this might be a wonderful opportunity for our group finding a temporary place. I want to thank you very much, Miguel, and those associated with you for providing us with that opportunity. I also, of course, am delighted, like I'm sure many of us working in Soviet era famines are, that there is such a pleasant place as Spain that was also experiencing famines and gives us an excuse to come here and to meet with you and share some of the problems associated with working on undeclared famines, famines that existed that were for various reasons sort of concealed by the authorities. And I thought it would probably be a good opportunity for me to talk about famines, problems of, well, food problems, famines, undeclared famines, and genocide. So that would be the topic I'm going to address now. Can't actually, sorry, I'll probably keep this up so I can see where I'm going. So I'll talk a bit about the concepts of famine, famine declarations, genocidal famines, together with their applicability to Russia and the USSR. Then I'll go on to talk about the nature and extent of food problems in different parts of Russia and the Soviet Union, and the extent to which these concepts really apply. In terms of concepts of famine, I think it's most important for us to distinguish between operational indicators of famine that are used for international comparisons, and then, if you like, more the historical meaning of famine, which is different, and which has, I think, a certain amount of cultural, historical meaning and needs to be seriously unpacked. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about these. Operational indicators, as Cormac has pointed out in his book, we normally start with the United Nations World Food Programme definition: food shortage crisis resulting in an increase in per capita mortality from daily death rates rising from more than 2 deaths per 10,000, with a severe famine defined as a similar situation, but when daily death rates rise by more than 5 deaths per 10,000. So these are very specific definitions, quantifiable. We can apply them to any society. I think it's useful to annualize these daily figures, and then they come up with sort of 2 deaths per 10,000 is equivalent to 73 deaths per 1,000 per year, and 183 deaths per 1,000 per year. Now, it's important to realise that famine mortality normally experiences a sharp peak, probably for a few days or weeks. It seldom lasts for a whole month or a whole year. I'll present you with some of the very detailed mortality monthly graphs for Russia, which I would make the claim is the best documented famine series you're likely to see, with monthly mortality figures, providing, I think, a fairly reliable indication of what is going on. I would never say that it's an exact indication of what is going on, but it is a form of indication, and I think it's probably better than most. I would like, however, to mention that the UNWFP definition seems to me to be mainly concerned with low-level population data. It seems to be a sort of guide for people operating in the field, probably at the village level, and at the village level, those figures, I think, probably do apply. Once you start moving into a higher level regionalisation, say a county or state level, I would suggest, and I'd be very interested to hear what Cormac, the main expert in this area, thinks, but I would have thought that when we do move from low level to the higher level, we would probably start calling a famine in these terms something which was significantly lower than the 73 deaths per 1,000 per year or the 183,000 per year. So my lecture is going to be a little bit strange, because instead of waiting for questions from you at the end. I'm going to throw out a few questions to you at the beginning. So I've put Cormac on warning regarding that. So this operationally significant definition isn't historically the way that people thought about famine. In historical times, they didn't have the statistical data to do that. Different societies at different times had different ideas about what they thought was an acceptable level of mortality in a crisis, and one which had gone beyond a certain level and so had to be treated as an exceptional case. And this is more, I think, the way that famine in the English language has been used, that it is a elevated level of, well, it's a risk of there being an elevated level of mortality beyond a certain level that is acceptable at the time. I think it's time sensitive. I've just said that this is the English, in English use of the word, and I think in other societies at different times, people have different levels of what is acceptable, and in sometimes there may not even be words available in those languages to make those kind of differences. Where are we going here? I just did a very quick Google test of graduations of hunger as they are. I ought to say, actually, I consider myself an economic historian, not a linguist or a specialist in these matters, so I'm moving very much out of my normal sphere. But I thought it interesting to look at what words are commonly used to express different gradations of hunger, which in English we would call famine, hunger, dearth. So I've got them here, and the first thing that is very well known to my group, but it's perhaps less known to the rest of you, is that if you're doing this in English, if you're doing it in Russian, Ukrainian, or many other Slavic languages, there actually isn't a different word, or at least I ought to perhaps say now that there didn't used to be a separate word for hunger and for famine. I'll come on later to say that I think starting from the Ukrainian, we've had a new word actually invented relatively recently to make that distinction, but that is a very modern change for most of, until really sort of probably about the 1970s or so. There wasn't any other word to distinguish. We had to use the same words. And so this is my question to the audience, which are, wonderful international group with lots of different languages coming from lots of places. And in fact, I was trying it out on our Swedes last night. What are the words in your languages to distinguish between these different gradations of food shortage? Is there some that are requiring or presuming that there is going to be an obligation of the state to do something? Whereabouts does that come? Can you trace over history where that was? I have a feeling that historically, what is acceptable as a level of mortality before you call upon, well, if I use the Russian expression, the extraordinary measures, famine relief measures, which in Russian we've often referred to as extraordinary measures that would be required. I have a feeling that in different societies, that's going to be highly dependent upon what is considered to be normal level of mortalities. If you're in a society where normal level of mortality is already, pre-demographic transition period of 40 per thousand, then in fact you're in a different situation from one when you're in a modern society with normal mortality levels below 20 per thousand. So I think historically there are these very important distinctions which we want to be very careful if we're using the current World Food Programme operational terms, because this isn't the way things were basically operating. I think we can make international comparisons of the extent of hunger measured in terms of mortality caused by hunger. But we have to be very careful regarding what we're causing as causation here. I think we distinguish between direct causation, Cormac was talking about this yesterday, dystrophy, starvation, or indirect causation, often associated with elevation of epidemic diseases, some of which may be actually directly connected to the famine that is taking place. But I would argue, and in Russia's case, there are some epidemic diseases that occur almost coincidentally at the time of major famines. I think this, and I'll come on to this in a few minutes, the 1891 famine in Russia, and Finland and other places, happened to coincide with, I think it was the fourth worldwide cholera pandemic. And the elevation of mortality in 1892, I think, is more related to the cholera uprise than others. So I say that we've got this problem with causation there. But nevertheless, I think we can make international comparisons of the extent of hunger measured in terms of mortality caused by hunger. But when it comes to comparisons of famine, I think we've got a much greater problem. I think we need to consider the words that we are using, their cultural and historical significance, and I regret that this is not always the way that it is done. Okay, what about famine declarations? Well, these are also dependent, of course, on the cultural meaning and expectations of the word. Are you in a situation in which you expect the state to have this kind of obligation, or will they be responsive to this? Now, more operational concepts for historians to use would concern the recognition of the problem, i.e., are we dealing with a society in which the state accepts that there is an elevated level of mortality or not, and whether this elevated mortality is caused by food shortage. We can talk about food shortages, elevated mortality as a result of food shortages, and actually the action of the states. Some states, not only are they denying famine, they're actually denying that there is an elevation of mortality resulting from food problems. And I actually think it's more useful for us to actually try to unpack the complex cultural, linguistic problems and deal more with direct things. So I'm very much in favour of us moving that direction. Also, it's a concern whether there are resolutions to be taken, whether the state is taking extraordinary measures in order to resolve the problems. And for Russian-oriented people with knowledge of Russia, this begins to get a little bit nervous, because the extreme action that the Bolsheviks began taking in terms of food supply problems were, of course, known as the extraordinary measures, and they were enforced by the Extraordinary Commission, which is basically the name of the Soviet sort of security forces. But perhaps it should remind us, as many of the scholars of French food problems know, that policy, policing, policy in terms of food supply often is related to policing issues. Where are we going? So, sorry, as I was saying, I think looking at famine declaration, well, what about genocidal famines? Now, this I think is doubly tricky because it involves the culturally dependent term famine and the problematic term genocide, which has also come to have different meanings. There's the United Nations definition, which was, as I think many of you know, accepted as a result of a political compromise. The only way the United Nations in 1948 could actually get a definition of genocide approved was by accepting the Soviet decision requirement that it excluded reference to any socioeconomic groups, so they were safe. But they're not the only, if you like, villains in this story, because the Americans weren't too keen on it including anything that could be concerned with, if you like, the attacks on indigenous people or in fact the black problem in America. And Australia as well very well might have a problem as regards its indigenous populations with such definitions. So these have actually been systematically taken out. Many people now, and particularly in Ukraine, will now then look at, say, well, let's go back to the original Lemkin definition of genocide, which did include cultural genocide and allows for all of these groups. But I mean, this is actually very problematic because almost every state that is involved in creating a national identity in those circumstances could be accused of genocide. It's often said, of course, that building the Soviet man is genocidal for the different ethnicities of the former Soviet Union, particularly Ukraine, but it has to be argued that it does also include Russians, so they could be accused of. So I mean, there are a lot of problems with the genocide aspect of this phrase, as well as there are with the famine one. So what I'm suggesting is that it's much better to use an operational term that avoids many of these. Something like the purposive use of starvation for mass killing, and you can specify specific groups if you want to get around closer towards the genocide, the United Nations definition of genocide. But I'm perfectly happy with saying that we ought to be looking at purposive starvation for mass killing of any group. So I'm happy with broadening that, and I think it has value to do so. Now, how are these terms being used in Russia and in Ukraine? In the 1970s, when I started writing on this subject, and I've been doing it for as long as, I suppose, Kolpak, there was outright denial in the Soviet Union that there had been high mortality caused by food problems in the 1930s and 1946. Now, I'm not saying that there was, well, what I am saying is there was not only denial of a famine, there was denial of an elevation of mortality. This could only be achieved, of course, by censorship, and there was censorship. It wasn't that there was no data. Now the archives are open, we know there's an abundant amount of data. But there was censorship of the idea that there had been an elevation of mortality related to food problems in the 1930s and in the 1940s. Before we get on to the question of, do we want to call it famine or not? So well, it was interesting. I went to Moscow in 1971, one of the guys I met was Yurii Moshkov. Moshkov had written a sensational book. It was sensational when he wrote it in 1966. There's a Zenovaya Problema v ugodie społecznej kolektywizacji. It's actually the grain problem in the years of full collectivization. That was really pushing the edge at the very end of the Khrushchev period. Well, by the time it was published, the Khrushchev period was over. He was very lucky to get the book out. It was only partly, I think, it was published by Moscow State University Press, which was, pushing the limit. But most censorship came down when Khrushchev went out a year or so earlier, and my main guru or historian who had the closest relationship with in Russia, Viktor Petrovich Danilov, had published a major had written a major critical account of Stalin's collectivization in the early 60s. It was all set up to be published in 64, and it was then completely closed down, censored. It never was published, and Victor was restricted to working on, which is the leading specialist on collectivization, was restricted to working on the pre-collectivization period. So these are the mechanisms by which there is a denial, not just of famine, but of all sorts of things. In this case, a situation that had caused elevated mortality. So I've lived through this thing for a long time. First of all, it was denial of elevated mortality before we actually got on to the question of whether this is famine or not, which, when you think about it, has a little bit of an odd meaning for a country in which there actually wasn't a separate word for famine and hunger in any case. From the 1990s, it became officially accepted that the food crisis of 32-33 had reached an exceptionally high level of mortality that warranted the description of famine. And it's largely a case of, the excessive importance of the English language that we're talking about it in those terms, because, say, in Russian, that issue doesn't really arise. Now, about this time, Ukrainian historians started using a new word, combining the elements of hunger and of death. This is holodomor, or in Russian, golodomor. And it was used at that time as a distinguishing feature from hunger. It was not just hunger, undefined, but a hunger that was causing mass death. And initially, the Russian government even was prepared to accept publications through the United Nations that used that terminology, thinking that it was only going to be used for mass deaths as a result of food shortage. But very soon it began to be used in a different concept, that this was an exceptional situation, often described as beyond any other kind of famine, and that it was connected with genocide, that it had genocidal intent. And this has become now very important within Ukrainian historians, and I really do regret it, because I think it is adding degrees of confusion, adding degrees that make it difficult to unpack this historically in operational terms. And oddly enough, I'm not the only guy who thinks like this. There's not all that many, but one of the guys who really does think like this is the guy that's often presented as being the champion of the genocidal impact of this famine, Robert Conquest. So I just want to say a few words about my relation with Robert Conquest in relation to this particular matter. When Bob Davies and I wrote The Years of Hunger in 2004, our publisher said, who's the biggest authority in this field? Who should we send it to review? And I said, well, undoubtedly, Robert Conquest is the best-known guy in this field. You could send it to him, but we didn't really think he was going to give us a good review for various reasons. Robert Conquest read that, and I should say that we actually, in our conclusions, I suppose, singled out Robert Conquest as a person with whom we disagreed. This is perhaps why we thought we weren't going to get a good review from him. And we had said that in our view, the famine had been caused by Soviet policy, excessive use of procurements in order to take grain from the peasantry, but it had been done because there was a major food crisis. They didn't feel they had enough grain. They were fearful that the cities were going to starve, and they were therefore taking it from the peasants to feed the towns. It wasn't, we thought, done on purpose to kill the peasants, but it was the result of a whole series of blunders, excessive confidence, wrong decisions taken at an earlier time, exporting grain when they thought they had it before they realised what a mess they actually were in. And the timing is very important in this. And we said we actually came to this conclusion that it was a series of errors and blunders, rather than the view typified by Robert Conquest that Stalin wanted a famine. Now, to my amazement, I received a response from Robert Conquest saying he would be prepared to give us a good review provided that we changed something in the conclusion, and that instead of us saying Robert Conquest thought that Stalin wanted a famine, we say that Robert Conquest thought that with a famine taking place, Stalin didn't do everything that he could have to save the lives of the peasantry. Well, I mean, I think it's highly arguable on terms of what he had earlier written, whether that was necessary. So, but we were perfectly happy to include in our conclusion the statement that Robert Conquest has now written to us to state that it is not his opinion that the famine was caused on purpose, which I would suggest in terms of genocidal intent makes it very clear that Conquest himself doesn't favour the description of the famine as genocidal. Anyway, in my earlier days, I had a rather stormy relationship with Robert Conquest as a postgraduate student. I had reviewed some of his literature, and I'd said he was actually his book on the terror. I had analysed his review of the scale of the labour camps and the terror, and argued that Conquest was perfectly correct in saying that these matters were of demographic significance. The terror did have demographic significance, but he's way off beam with the scale of either mortality or, in fact, numbers of people in the labour camp. Whereas he was saying something like 7 million at the end of the 1930s. It is very clear from the literature that had been produced before, including OSS investigations if you look at the economic literature of the major national income accounts experts or the agriculture experts, that it was clearly that there could hardly be more than 3 million. So this had been an argument that rambled on in British and American journals for a very long time. In fact, it was still rambling until the Soviet archives opened up. And for a long time, it actually still continued after that. And Conquest was denying that the materials coming out of the archives were at all correct, and that Wheatcroft was obviously foolish in accepting them at face value. And then at some point, he changed. But from the more popular view, the interpretation was the archives have demonstrated that Conquest's general point about the overall significance of repression and the peasants was correct. So in the end, Conquest became sort of the great hero, and I just feel a little miffed that the whole thing disappeared, even though archives did actually prove that I was right. But anyway, in my later life, I had a much closer relationship with Robert Conquest, who I visited, and we were actually quite friendly. I visited him at his home in Stanford. But if you read any of the literature, you'll find that I am often portrayed as the major critic of the genocidal argument, which has, and Conquest is normally presented as the propagator of that. In fact, we had an important conference in Harvard not long ago when these views were presented. Conquest, of course, has died now, so he can't speak for himself. I wasn't there, but the video of the conference is available on the net. And one of the girls from Groningen actually said, everyone here is presenting Robert Conquest as being the champion of the genocide. In fact, the meeting was opened by the Ukrainian ambassador, who said it was very important we were talking about the Ukrainian famine as it was the largest genocide there had ever been. Everyone, including Terry Martin and Oleg Klevnov, kept quiet. One girl from the audience, they did say, we had recently had a visit from Professor Wheatcroft who had said that actually Conquest's view was not that this was a genocide. Why is it that everyone is presenting Robert Conquest as being the champion of genocide? And to his sins, Nicholas Wirth said, everyone in the field knows this is an old story. I would recommend all of you not to believe anything that Wheatcroft says about Conquest or Conquest says about Wheatcroft. And I thought that absolutely disgraceful. Anyway, sorry, I'm going aside. But what I mean to say is that I think there are serious problems with those interpretations and have a degree of history behind it. My conclusions regarding definitions. I agree with Robert Conquest that using the word genocide is not accurate or useful in describing the Soviet famine of 32-33. I'm not opposed to using the words when they are appropriate. And it is clear to me that the German hunger plan, as worked out by Herbert Bacher and as actually implemented in Poland, Ukraine, the occupied parts of the USSR, really was a genocidal famine. I regret that so much effort is made to present the Soviet famine of 32-33 as a genocide, while the real genocidal famine of 1941-44 is largely ignored. Fortunately, I think German historians are finally getting around to correct this. As we've got a bit of time, I'd like to go on and talk about the nature and extent of the food problems in different parts of the Soviet Union at different times, and see how this actually sort of works out in practice here. Ermolov, his classic account of the history of famines in Russia, produced in 1903, he had been a very important late Tsarist famine administrator, argued that for the Russian state, the idea that they had an obligation to provide famine relief for its subjects was totally lacking until the reign of Boris Godunov. That's early in the 17th century, at the beginning of the times of troubles. And then was little developed until the reforms of the late 19th century. The formative period, when I presume some of the words beginning to have meaning, would probably, I suppose, be associated with the Mongol conquest. If you look at the differences, I had for a long time always subscribed to the Halperin view that the Mongol conquest's importance has been overestimated, but I'm beginning to doubt that now. If you could imagine, Mongol conquest has just taken place. A few remnant Russian princes like Alexander Nevsky tries to hang on to some form of power, and will do this by going to the great Khan, laying before him and asking him, what services could he apply? Can I fight the Germans who are invading? Could you imagine Alexander Nevsky saying to the Grand Khan in such circumstances, the people back there are starving, can you give us some food aid? That is not the way the Mongol conquest of Russia operated. And maybe that is one of the reasons why you don't have these words that were actually in use in Europe, but at that time. Boris Godunov, who of course was a usurper and in a rather sort of desperate position trying to shore up his popularity, did try to buy popularity by handing out grain in a time of famine in Moscow, and it was an almighty calamity. This is about 1603. Masses of the population then moved to Moscow in order to get the famine relief, totally overwhelmed the situation. It's what modern famine administrators would know. It's not the thing to do. You don't say, we're going to be giving out lots of aid in the capital, come if you want to be safe from starvation. That is a disaster, and Boris showed it to be so. And this ushered in the time of the troubles, which were only ended with the election of the Romanov dynasty a few years later. Peter the Great, following Western models, does begin to introduce a granary system, but Peter's main problem, and I think Russian historiography tends to confuse this, Peter's great problem was having moved the capital from Moscow, which incidentally isn't an easy place to supply with food in any case, up to where St. Petersburg is, which was in a major food deficit area. There was enormous problems in doing that. Most accounts of Russian history say Peter opened a window on Europe. St. Petersburg, I can almost see Paris. That is not the way it was like at the beginning of the 18th century. You've got our bolts here. So beginning of the 18th century, the Baltic area was a famine-prone zone. Peter had moved the capital into a major famine zone prone for military reasons, very clearly. This did imply enormous food supply problems. famine was what we would call, well, elevated mortality as a result of food problems was an enormous thing in the early years of the foundation of St. Petersburg. And it will remain so until Catherine puts in the canals, sends Potemkin down into the Ukraine, colonizes the great southern steppe, opens it up to grain farming, and establishes a new world grain surplus area. Remember, Europe's going to develop as a great requirement for food grain through the 19th century, and we're all used to hearing the grains are coming from the New World, tend to forget that the largest source of this New World grain was actually from the Russian steppe. So this actually worked so well, so much grain became available, that in fact St. Petersburg didn't have the enormous problems that it did do afterwards. That it had done earlier. But it is still a very important thing having your capital in an area which is very difficult to supply by food and is thousands of kilometers away from your main food source. For economic historians, actually, this is great, because one of our main problems is seeing how food is provided into the cities. In many localities, when the distances aren't very far, the peasants just put the grain on a cart and take it into the city, and it's very difficult to measure that. You've got no idea really what is going on. But in Russia, where the grain into the major food deficit area has to go by canal or later by rail, we have really good statistics on that. So Russia is going to develop into a country in which the northern consumer region, Moscow, and particularly St. Petersburg in the north, but in fact where most of the industry is located, will require by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the First World War, 5 million tons of grain coming from the south. Well, it'll get that. It's no problem once the Ukraine, the southern produce region, it's not only Ukraine, it's Ukraine and the North Caucasus, start producing large grain surpluses. In fact, they're capable of exporting up to 10 million tons of grain a year. So the 5 million that actually goes up to the northern consumer region would, in pre-revolutionary times, in the first decade of the 20th century, come primarily from the central agricultural area, the Volga, what I call the central production region, and some coming in from the east with a new surplus producing region, Ural, Siberia, Kazakhstan. So it actually works. It holds it together, and there don't seem to be any food problems. 1891 is the first time that we begin talking about famine in Russia. It's the year when we've very soon after modern statistical systems gone in. They're only systematically sort of counting grain and publishing the results from the 1880s. There's much greater awareness of these kind of things. Demographic data is now available. There is a major food shortage, but what is not totally realised is that the amount of aid, although Robbins in his classic book on the famine of 1891-92 does point out that he thought that he would, as a political historian, he had studied the famine of 1891-92 to find out what was wrong with the Russian administrative system, expecting that, in fact, the Russian administration system was going to demonstrate how bad it was, which would partly explain why there was subsequently a revolution. And it's a wonderful book because it's totally honest. He says this was his presumption when he wrote the book, but when he got into the subject, he was amazed at how enormous the aid that was provided by the Russian state was. Far greater than anything Britain was doing in Ireland or in India, enormous amounts of food aid. And I've gone further in print, arguing that if you look carefully at the timing of the mortality in the 1891-92 famine, it's clear that mortality starts peaking after the summer of 1892, when food prices are going down, when famine relief operations are going down, but when cholera, morbidity and mortality are rising. So I actually think you've got the paradigm. I mean, I like pushing it a little bit. I'd argue that, in fact, okay, it was a famine, there was a threat of elevated mortality, enormous food aid was put in, as a result of which mortality was probably lower than it otherwise would have been. But then the cholera pandemic came along, elevated mortality, and all of the deaths from cholera were attributed to the famine, so it looked like a light famine that had enormous mortality. But that is, I think, the story of 1891-92. 1906 was an enormous drought, and the amount of food aid, again, not only organised by the Zemstva, the local government agencies, but by the economic department of the Ministry of Interior. No one wanted to give credit to the economic or to the Ministry of the Interior whatsoever. Anyway, they avoided famine. You don't hear about it. It's never described as a famine. It was a very serious drought that was, well, at a time of revolution, of course, that was avoided. Misunderstandings as to how much food was available meant that when Russia entered the First World War, it was totally unprepared for the circumstances in which, I mean, this is a country that it was the world's largest grain exporter. If you count America and Canada separately, Russia is bigger. Russia is 10 million. Each of them is about 8 million or so. Together they're more, but separately they're not. So no one was expecting there to be a famine in Russia, a food problem. The government refused to accept that there was a problem. There has to be plenty of food, but all the food was down in the south, in Ukraine. It wasn't getting out of the Black Sea, but there were enormous difficulties in moving it into the north, particularly when priority was given to the army. Large numbers of the army, was it sort of 8-10 million in the army, and most of the army being located in the northwest, in the food deficit area. So there were enormous food crises that weren't recognised. And of course, the revolution takes place amidst the food riots caused by this difficult supply problem. And I would argue that food supply problem will remain very much the central problem for Russia right through 20s, 30s, Second World War, particularly when the Germans occupy the main grain production region. I've probably I'm taking a little bit longer than I want to, so I'll quickly go through these and get on to. Sorry, I'm having difficulty moving this. Looking on to the day, these are the famines that will subsequently take place. Following the revolution, we're actually seeing, I think, two famines taking place in close proximity. Northern cities are in famine from 1917 to 1921. Basically because of the difficulties of supply into there. The Soviet government does declare this as a famine. The British government, who is maintaining a blockade, of course, refuses to accept it as a famine. But it is undeniable that there is mass mortality taking place as a result of elevated of food shortages. These are the levels of mortality recorded in Moscow and St. Petersburg in these years. They're actually, these are annualized monthly figures. So we're getting above the 70. But as I say, I think if one was to apply the UNWFP level, that would be appropriate for almost villages. If you're getting 70 per thousand for an entire city, there's absolutely no question that this is extreme and extraordinary. In response to the famine that is taking place, the state begins applying extraordinary measures which will become a major formative aspect of the Soviet state. An aspect that we ought to realize, which you probably don't normally associate with a food problem. We normally give totally political interpretations of the origins of the Cheka, and I'm opposing that here. The state is not only, it's taking extraordinary measures, it's requisitioning grain from the peasantry, it is actually shifting the impact of the food shortages from the groups that it wants to protect in the major cities. It's not been protecting them very well because we've had deurbanization on an almost unprecedented level. The population of both Moscow and St. Petersburg each were over 2 million before this period. They're going to fall down to 1 million and even less in St. Petersburg, which is in the most vulnerable situation. Not coincidental that the Russians moved the capital back to Moscow, which actually can be fed. It's often said there was a military reason for doing this. There is a military reason for doing it, but there's also a fundamental food supply problem issue in doing this. The Baltic states and Finland get independence, as does Poland, but and there's a good military international relationship with that. But there's also an economic one. These are food deficit areas. So the Bolsheviks want actually to decrease their supply problems at this time. Now, after a couple of years of really intensive requisitioning of the peasantry now is in a weaker position. And when in 1921 there's a very serious drought, this then moves the famine from an urban northern famine into a massive southern famine, particularly in the Volga, but also affecting other areas. So this will be the main thing, which was declared. The Bolsheviks were very keen to try to appeal for aid, and they got massive assistance. So I mentioned Nansen. There was a slight bit of rivalry between Nansen and Hoover and the ARA. Nansen's heart was in this matter, but he didn't control the grain. The Nansen organizations produced really only a very minor fraction of food that went to...
Save time for questions.
Okay. So let me just quickly flash. This is the Volga 21-22 famine. This is the 32-33. As you see, particularly in the worst affected area, Kiev Oblast, the annualized monthly mortality going up to 300 per thousand. So this is really very serious stuff. This is in the rural areas, the urban areas. We've got maps, we can see exactly where it was located. Second World War, I say this is the one that really is genocidal, but of course we have less data in the truly genocidal areas that were in German occupation, but it's really serious in the non-occupied, particularly of course Leningrad. Here we have the Leningrad mortality figures. in association with parts of the northern consumer region that weren't occupied. And here we have the 46, 47 mortality. So they're all fairly well and maps of that as well. So my conclusions would be, Soviet Union experienced many serious food supply problems in its short history, which resulted in greatly elevated mortality in some places and some years. Some were related directly to the problems of supplying its food deficit regions in the north with grain surpluses generated from the south in times of civil war or war, when normal supplies were disturbed. The northern urban famines of 1721 and 41-40. Some were related indirectly to these problems as a result of the extraordinary measures that had been applied by the state to ensure these northern supplies by requisitioning grain or forcibly purchasing it from the peasants predominantly in the south. As I said before, I agree with Robert Conquest that none of these problems were wanted by the Soviet leadership, but the Stalin and the Soviet leadership would always act to favour urban industrial groups in their attempts to resolve these problems. Although the Soviet leadership was generally hostile and suspicious of the peasantry, I do not think that they acted in a genocidal manner towards them. The famines experienced by the Slavic and Jewish populations in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova and the Baltic republics and occupied parts of the RSFSR were genocidal and need to be recognised as such. I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. And now your question, please, here.
Well, as a teammate of Professor Wheatcroft, I'd like to make two observations. I think I was at this conference at Harvard on the Ukrainian famine Holodomor. I think there are many, but I think I was in that one. The use of Holodomor is certainly, in a sense, problematic. Literally really means killing by hunger. Stalin did kill, whether it's intentional or not intentional. It's a problem, but he let people die. There is no doubt about it. Now, in a sense, the spread of the term Holodomor is a contribution of Ukrainians, just as the Jews made the Holocaust unique term. And there are some disagreements about the use of term among the Jews. But Holodomor itself is not so bad in the judgment as long as we know that it was a killing by famine, because Stalin let people die, intentional or not. He let people die. He didn't go out of his way to save millions of people's lives. He did extend aid to Ukraine, but it was too little too late. So I use the term Holodomor. I refrain from using the term genocide because it all depends on definitions. And we cannot go into myriads different definitions. So yes, I agree with you. It must kill. That's much more straightforward. Now, as far as the archives are concerned, you're right. We still don't have the clear evidence that Stalin wanted to kill Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, but not ethnic Russians or ethnic Poles. We still don't have clear evidence, which is slightly different, or quite different from what happened in the Holocaust. We do know that the Germans intended to kill certain groups of people, Jews, homosexuals, and so on, gypsies or Romans. We don't have Slavs, many Slavs, that's a even grander scale, yes, Poles and Russians. Ukrainians were dangerous because Ukrainians were potential separatists. Russians were not dangerous. So if Stalin had to sacrifice peasants, then Ukrainians were worse off than Russians because Ukrainians were potentially more dangerous. So this is a distinction we need to have in mind. Now, when we all know that Russia is often a mystery, it's a country of secrecy, there's so much degree of secrecy. Even in the archives, we do know that archives have opened up, but there's so much still kept secret. So when all of these secret archives open up, we may have a slightly or radically different view of the event. We may not, but we may. So I like to keep that option open without closing that this is all not genocide or this is not the term spread by the community, is misleading. I think it's important for us to keep some escape route because we are not 100% sure. I think that way we can keep having dialogue with the people with whom we disagree. Another point maybe, if I can make, I've been battling against Russian imperialist discourse. And I recently had one-sided debate with a famous American professor of Russian literature, in which he wanted to propagate this idea of global Russian culture, which he confused with Russian language culture. In Ukraine, of course, we have widespread Russian language literature. So I complained to many people that why should we use this Russian imperialist expression like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. For us, there's nothing great about Peter or Catherine. They are the epigons of Russian imperialist aggrandizement. So it would be, I think it would be nice if we could use Peter the First, Catherine the Second, with neutral term, and let's get rid of the Great. So we don't say George Washington the Great. We don't say that.
Yeah, what we're going to say about Elizabeth II is going to be very interesting.
In Germany, maybe they say Friedrich der Große. I don't know how popular now it's more Prussian sort of agency. We have Alexander the Great, but that's so old that it doesn't matter. But in modern times, we really don't use this term the Great. So why do we use the Great for Russian rulers? These are those who destroyed Ukraine and other minorities in the Russian Empire. So if we start using Peter I, Catherine II, I think we may be better off. We can better communicate with people in the former Soviet Union. These are just friendly critiques.
No, thanks very much. I think sounds as though we're in agreement. I have no problem in leaving things open for the possibility that other evidence could be found that shows things. But at the moment, I think what you're saying is there is no evidence of genocide, and if there's no evidence of genocide, it would seem to be inappropriate to presume that there was. I have no problem in using the word Holodomor, provided we understand that when we say Holodomor, we are not implying genocide and intentional killing. And I agree with Hero and with Robert Conquest, and I hope that we can get more people into this area. But at the moment, I think if you were to ask many scholars, they would think that this was a minority position and that the majority are still wanting to use the word genocide for the famines.
Igor.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Actually, as far as I can notice, Stephen, I agree with you. You made a, I don't know how to put it. You use for the first time, as far as I know, the term mass killing. So it's not about intention, it's not about genocide, and we discussed a lot about that. The definition, which was the result of the political, let's say, compromise between Soviets and Americans especially, and very good that you added Australia as well, because it's not about America, it's about the Western countries, the New World, and so on and so on. What I wanted to say is that in the end, actually, my perception was that you deny what you said in the beginning, actually, because mass killing means killing, by whom? Yeah. In the end, you said the confusion is from that different terms. You said mass killing. Finally, you should admit that this is mass killing, and it's a great, let's say, advancement, I would say, from the part of the economic historians in regard to this, to the famine issue in the Soviet Union. But confusions comes from the fact, in the end, you said the famine could not have, you don't agree with the genocidal consequences. I think we should go forward for it. Yeah, genocide, it's very confusing and very political and very so on and so on and so on. But why not? Why not to use genocidal consequences? Because it goes well. It's coherent with what we said in the beginning with mass killing. Otherwise, mass killing by whom? By climate, by whatever.
Well, indeed. Indeed.
So the reason,
It's not at all.
And I agree with you basically that we should move to use more kind of neutral terms in dealing with famine. For instance, responsibility of the power, whatever. Because if you rule out this kind of stuff, mass killing by whom? Again, by whom? If it's not genocidal. Why not admit genocide in terms of the scale? Yes, we have millions, and you know very well. Yeah, in the 30s, killed by whom? If it's not genocidal, in consequences. Yeah, it's I don't see the contradiction. It feels that in the end you kind of denying, making a very big confusion in what you said throughout your presentation.
Well, I'm sorry you feel like that. I don't feel I'm confused, and I think I use the word mass killing in very many publications. When I'm looking at the terror and I'm seeing people being shot, this is mass killing. I don't think that I will say now that I don't think that in fact the famine was meant on purpose. People were not trying to kill people in the famine. They had the option of providing a limited amount of relief. Who got the relief? They are going to decide that they want to give it to their friends as opposed to people who they don't trust and are fearful of, but I don't think they actually wanted to kill any specific people. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I just would like to join to the previous commentators and maybe reflect like how the problem is, as you mentioned, is the using of the term genocide is one thing, like because it is politicization of the famine, it's fine that if a person or researcher have different like ideas in mind, but I think that if we are rejecting the term of Holodomor, which is you discussed was created specifically to explain the difference of Ukrainian famine compared to famines in different regions of Soviet Union, in particular in Kazakhstan. Like Kazakh famine has own definition, and it doesn't mean that like researchers of this field doesn't have like the right to use it if it is it was created in specific conditions by diaspora or some community of scholars. And I think that if we have more differentiation in like vision of these regional famines, we could make a much bigger like picture understanding of the specificity of each of those cases. But in the historiography, when some scholars would use the term of like Soviet famines of 1932-33, we do not understand the difference, and that's why like we have the same like kind of general understanding that it happens like in the same scale all over the Soviet Union, and it means that for instance it was the same in Ukraine, it was the same in Russia, it was the same like in Moscow, but for scholars who have understanding and have the data on each of these regional cases, it makes sense to use even different definitions, like for Ukrainian famine, for famine, for example, in Moldavia, in Kazakhstan, like just to understand what we are dealing with, and and here I'm not saying about even any political meanings like genocide or not, but just to see the difference, because I have seen that in some groups scholars could use like even the term Holodomor for understanding of Soviet famines in general, but it seems that it is confusing. It's a picture, but if we have like difference for each of these cases, we would make a better understanding of the specificity in each of those regions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't actually agree that using I mean, if you want to communicate with other people, it's best to use terms that people can understand and can apply anywhere. And saying every country is exceptional in the view of its own historians isn't going to help us really understand things. So no, I mean, I think that I find it more useful to talk about mass killing or about mass mortalities. Mass killing, I think, does imply that there is someone who is doing the killing, but I don't think that that applies to the famines, and I think the famines, it's a selection as to who gets the relief, but selecting who gets the relief is not really... Well, it means that the people doing the selecting are trying to avoid responsibility for not providing relief to the ones who are not getting it, and to some extent who don't feel that they have an obligation to provide for everybody, but in fact don't have the capability of providing for everybody. But I don't think using individual words that only have specific meanings to the historians of specific countries because they consider their country to be so totally exceptional that it can use its own special words for it is actually a useful way for academics to progress.
That is first.
Thank you. I think that in this case, academics can learn new specific words. It's the purpose of distinguish between countries and cases. And so if you go down this legal definition about genocides and so forth, this crimes against humanity, this crime doesn't need to prove intentionality. So if some scholars...
Second degree.
Yeah, so it's if someone wants to think about definitions, there is the ask definition. My question would be very simple about Kazakh famine. Kazakh famine, how does it fit into your scheme you presented? How the Kazakh famine in Kazakhstan fit into your interpretation of Soviet famines?
Now, the famine in Kazakhstan is really interesting because it is very, very different. And what is happening in Kazakhstan is primarily nomadic populations are being settled with livestock being the basis of the economy rather than grain. So it's totally different in many regards to these other famines, but it does have the element of taking place at the time in which there is a major food problem in the Soviet Union when grain prices are going very high and nomadic populations that suddenly partly through natural reasons because of a drought, but partly also because of the policy of trying to enforce settlement on them, those populations that are losing their control over their livestock are going to be in a very difficult situation, and the aid that is normally given to them would be in the form of grain, and if that's at a time when there's a major grain shortage, it's going to have enormous mortal consequences. So actually the Kazakh famine on a per capita basis it begins a year before the Ukrainian famine. It's a very high mortality in 31, 32, before 32, 30, 33, and possibly eases up a little bit later on, but is of a magnitude that is actually much greater per capita than in Ukraine. Your question?
Yes, I have two questions. One regarding the 1891-92, and you mentioned that, so there's a lot of aid, that famine relief that is actually into place, but I was thinking then, and you linked this then to the spread of epidemics, that's the rise of mortality. So is there a distribution issue that sort of links these? Was the distribution organized through in centric places that would lead to congestion and gatherings and thus spread of epidemics? Or is there something other going on? And then the other question that I'm interested to hear, I like the point that you raised about the denial or the differences of how levels of nuances that are inscribed into denial of famine or denial of mortality or denial of food supply issues or grain issues. And my first idea is that isn't this a source-specific assessment problem, kind of? So, depending on so you would on base. So I would be interested to hear, how do you determine, or do you have a sort of idea, or do you just go by source and define is the source denying an issue, or is it just a matter of shifting of perspective, or what the source wants to emphasize of a matter? As for instance, like an example to clarify the point is the Finnish famine of the 1860s up till 1980s. It's mostly, I would say, in historical literature and scholarship, it's an agricultural issue. So all the data is available for the historians, but it's you would go to agricultural history journals and that type of literature. So it's a specific niche that doesn't come across. Nowadays it's all over the economic and social history of Finland, but that didn't used to be the case. And I was thinking, is that a part of the denial, or is it just a legitimate focus issue?
I mean that may be an issue there, but in the 1930s and the 1940s there is strict censorship. So there's absolutely no doubt that there is complete denial. There's official history it's written that exclude it, and you are not allowed to mention it. And as you say, Moshkov and Danilov, who got very, very close to it, when the policy tightens up a little bit, they you can identify very clearly where the line is. Yes. Oh, sorry.
I just want to say that probably this issue of denial is maybe more serious
and leave it out, because it's really difficult to organise and to mobilise relief when you deny that the problem exists in the first place.
Yeah.
And you might kind of ask in a counterfactual way, had there been freedom of information, how much would that have helped to reduce the problem? But more generally, I suppose my regret about this session is that, you know, the talk about Ukraine will go on and on and on, and sometimes it makes progress, sometimes it goes around in circles. What I think we missed out on here is more discussion on the famines of World War II. I think that is where we know least in Soviet famine history. And I think that is where we have most to learn. We know things about Leningrad, but, you know, Ukraine had a very serious famine problem during World War II, very serious. And it tends to get overlooked and occluded by all the focus on 32, 34.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you. I just ask, are you talking about occupied Ukraine or unoccupied?
Well, most of Ukraine is occupied for most of it.
Yeah. No, what I mean, I would argue certainly in the occupied areas, of course,
Yeah.
it's very difficult. But there is also very serious famine. Well, a famine which in any other country would have been considered to be very serious in the unoccupied areas. But of course, it's less serious than even 46, 47 or elsewhere.
Miguel.
I think you wanted to talk too. Why you before?
Miguel.
Oh yeah.
And then Philip.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your paper. I think that it was fantastic, very illustrating. And I have a question and also a reflection. The question is about something that you referred to, and it's do you think that we could say that for European famines in contemporary history, 19th and 20th century, cities, urban centers have been always favored by the state and by the even international relief?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Would you say that throughout European contemporary history, urban centers, the cities have been favored in terms of food supply during famines? I mean, do you think that this is a general trend? Because for what you have said, it gives me the impression, at least for the Soviet case and for the 20th century, but I would like to know your opinion and an expert in European famines. And second, I know that it's very difficult to generalize, but I think that it's worth to make comparisons, because I think that answers many questions about how the state is built. Actually, something very, very interesting that you mentioned is how the way Bolsheviks deal with hunger and food helped to build the Bolshevik state. And this is something that I've never thought about, and that could be seen also in the Spanish case, and I'm sure that in other cases. That's why I'm asking this question. And the second reflection is about genocide, and this is something that involves Spaniards as well, because we have this debate as well about the American conquest of the 16th century and 17th century, and paradoxically we're using a 20th century term in order to refer to an historical process that took place in the 16th and the 17th century. And I'm not going to go into it, but we also use it for the mass killings of the Francoist dictatorship, right? So my impression is that here we're dealing with things related with the theory of history, right? What's the role of the historians? What is history and what is memory, right? And from my point of view, these terms, as are broadly used by the rest of the society outside the academia, probably are not very useful in order to explain the complexities of the past, because there are always victims, but there's always executioners, and it could be in the same nation, even perpetrators. Thank you. And from my point of view, I think that a historian has to explain the past with all the complexities. Of course, we have to use concepts, But at the same time, we have to be aware that outside the academia, the battle cannot be won at any case.
The battle
Cannot be won at any case, because there's gonna be always, we're talking about identity, right? We're talking about what we are, where we're coming from, or what we want to be. And I think that we have to make a clear division between our internal debates about complexities, pros, contracts, and what's happening outside the academia.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first question, who was favoured in Russia? I mean, the Soviet Union is very, very clear. I think the enormous shock of deurbanization of the 1918, 17 to 20 period is very difficult to get your head around. I mean, I don't think we've had, I mean, even in wartime, you don't, you know, Paris or the capital city has lost half of its population. You've got to go to Pol Pot in Cambodia, year zero or something, to find a degree of deurbanization, where the political center was located, and that was such a massive shock that there was reinforced, I think, measures to safeguard, you know, the northern capitals after that. But I think any society which is based in the capital city will tend to favour the capital city where it's based. My argument is why it's particularly important here is because you know, the capital cities are located in places which are difficult to supply, so it does actually require a lot of force. I think there are actually similarities with China in this regard, because when the Chinese capital is moved from, you know, the southern capital of Nanjing up to Beijing, up into the north, you have to take extraordinary measures, build large canals, have a whole structure, superstructure, actually an imperial substructure. This partly explains why these are empires we're talking about here, and it does have consequences. But yeah.
Thanks. Mine's a very quick invitation for reflection throughout the conference. I think you raised some really interesting questions about the relationship between the ways in which states operate, they're built, and the way in which they deal with food crises, the way in which food crises influence them as they develop. We're talking about socialist states, but then we're talking about fascist states in Spain, in Germany in the Second World War. I think that's probably a connection between our different studies of Spain and the Soviet Union and Germany in the war that we should perhaps develop in more detail as we go on in the next couple of days or next day, to think about not only how the political structures of these states, their economic situations, influence the way in which they see and deal with food problems, but the way in which food problems help shape, determine how those states develop. We're talking about young states in many cases, the Soviet Union and Germany, and this interaction, which I find quite interesting in the Spanish case as well.
I agree. Yeah, no, I think it's a sensible reflection.
Okay. One more questions or not? No. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you.